All right, we're flipping the script today.
All right.
We have a special guest host, ARYEH BLANSHAY, our Director of Communications.
A little bit of a difficult topic on the agenda for today. Senator Sanders, he proposed a few resolutions that were designed to block the sale of some weapons to Israel. Today, you wrote a letter to our community about the direction in which our senators here in Massachusetts voted. And while the letter received almost entirely support from our community and confidence in our work at JCRC, there is still always going to be a small minority of people who are more critical voices in this space who express concern. And so I'd like to take this time to address some of that concern and I think get a little bit of clarity around the way in which we operate in Greater Boston and the way we represent sort of these multitudes to our community, to our congressional delegation, and to broader society. Can you elaborate a little what our role really is in this space?
It's important to start by saying that there is a part of JCRC's work that is direct lobbying, and that is primarily at the state house level. And so there's a member of our team who's a registered lobbyist. We have outside lobbyists, and certainly at the state level, we take direct positions on certain legislation and advocate for that legislation and budget items all the time. It's very rare that we lobby on an issue as JCRC on the federal level. With our federal delegation, and frankly with all public officials in Massachusetts, an important part of our relationship with them is representing the diversity of voices within our own network in conversation with them, helping them to know and see and understand what the conversation is that we are having at the JCRC table. Where are there differences of opinion, where there's consensus, and frankly, how to even hold some of that difference in their own relationships with our community.
So when we have a wide range of viewpoints in our community, how do we translate those viewpoints into actionable advice to our leadership, especially to policymakers?
Well, since you're asking the question today, so we're talking about in the context of our federal delegation here in Massachusetts, I'm often in conversations with one or another of them, and they're like, where is the community at? What are people talking about? How are people feeling about the following? What have you heard? That's the kind of question they're often asking me. I'll often say, look, this is where a lot of people are thinking. This is how a lot of people are feeling. This is the conversation that's playing out. Here are the differences I am hearing amongst my own members about this issue.
So going back to here's how people are thinking. Where do we get that sense of how people are thinking? Because you have people who saw your letter today and came back and said, well, some data that I've seen or some polls I've seen show that American Jews feel like this. And then, other people say the exact opposite.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, and there's a lot of layers to it. And I'm happy to go into many of those layers, including polling data that shows different things and polling data that sometimes shows contradictory things about where American Jews are at. And frankly, owning that polling data, while it may be a snapshot of a particular moment in time on a national level, is rarely as precise and granular as to tell you what are Jews in Greater Boston thinking about X issue. That's just a general rule. So polling has its limitations. And it's also very much of a time and a place. A poll taken, for example, the Pew poll, which was done, I think it was like late August, early September, and was released just before Iran launched its latest ballistic missile attack on Israel, had some findings about where American Jews were thinking about the prosecution of the war in Gaza that frankly showed us all over the map. And that was interesting to look at. It didn't necessarily tell you exactly how Jews in, say, Brookline were thinking about it. And it was also in a moment right before Iran attack. So it's always a take it as you will with polls. What we do, the formal part of our process here in Boston at JCRC, is about our actual council.
So talk to me about what that looks like and how that works.
We are, at our core, a network of other Jewish organizations. Right now, there are some 40 member organizations of JCRC. Some of them are prominent, well-known across the community. For example, Combined Jewish Philanthropies, ADL, AJC. We have 3 Hadassah chapters, 2 JCCs, several other cultural organizations, representatives of various arms of several Jewish congregational and denominational institutions, like the Orthodox Reform and conservative movements in their various parts. Those 40 organizations actually own JCRC.
And within them, there is a diversity of opinion.
There's a huge diversity of opinion in that table. I mean, we have a framework, our mission statement, and every organization at the table, when they join JCRC, is essentially saying we are aligned and not in opposition with the JCRC mission statement. It is a mission statement that talks about our support for Israel as a Jewish, secure, and democratic state, about the United States as a just democracy and fair. And it talks about, our commitment to a vibrant Jewish community here in Boston and around the world. So all of our member organizations are committed to that. Those are nice big words, and obviously they can have incredibly different understandings of what those words mean. You all went out a couple of weeks ago and asked people on the street what democracy means. The answers were all over the place. And so when we say we're committed to Israel as a democracy, people interpret that differently. For example, what does just mean in the United States? People have different interpretations. But the point is we have these 40 organizations at the table, and you can go to our website and say, oh, these are the 40 organizations that sit at this table. Now, we bring them together in a number of different ways. We bring them together quarterly in a council meeting, we call it, which us being Boston looks a lot like a New England town meeting. And that means people are coming in. Sometimes there are guest speakers. Sometimes there are questions on the table that we put to them. For example, the week before the election at our quarterly town meeting council, knowing that people would look to us to say something after Election Day this month, we put that question to them, and they were talking in small groups and as a whole table about how we should respond to the election.
It's important to say that we're not just feeling their mood, we're putting them in conversation with each other. We are convening our community.
Yes, they're in conversation with each other. They're in conversation with us. They're sitting across difference. Some of them, this is the only place maybe they're interacting with certain other parts of the community. I mean, it is a reality that even in the small microcosm of the Boston area Jewish community, like so much of the American civic problem right now, people live in their bubbles. And somebody might live in a bubble that is cultural, political, ideological, religious, even within our little community. And so often they find themselves sitting in circles with people that they have deep disagreements with about some of the big issues of the day, even as they agree in principle about our commitment to America as a just and fair society. So we put that question to them, how should we respond to the election? What should we say? And without getting into all the particulars, some of it was broad-based. What are the values we're holding? How do we show up? How do we represent the values and interests of this Jewish community in whatever we say after Election Day? And in some ways, it was very particular words. We actually said to them, here's a word we're thinking about using in a statement. What do you think about it? Not only in this meeting, but follow up with that afterwards. Email, call us, let us know in the coming days what you think about the use of these words versus other words in a message, not knowing who at that point was actually going to be elected the following week. And those are the kind of conversations we'll have with them. And from time to time, between meetings, things come up. They may be things where we know where we stand, broadly speaking. They may be things where we actually haven't really engaged them in a conversation in quite a while. And we will take the temperature of the room. Literally, and we'll reach out to the council, to these 40 organizations, the members of our board, to the community reps in the room, to the executive directors and regional directors of all of our members, and say, we want to get a feel of the room. We want to know where people are at on an issue. Let us know what you think. And we hear back. And we hear back a lot. And it's actually quite interesting to go through that feedback with our staff team, with our board leadership, and say, what are we hearing here? What are we seeing here?
Right, because our responsibility is to hold some sort of center with this wide range of voices. It's not just everything that we think, and it's not just entirely making everyone 100% happy. There's some balance that we have to strike.
People sometimes think that what JCRC is standing for or representing is somehow what Jeremy wants or what Jeremy believes. And that's not accurate. Certainly, if we ever got to a place where the council landed at a certain place on what we think about something that was fundamentally not aligned with my comfort zone, that would be a problem I'd have to negotiate as a professional.
Our community has put their trust in you.
Well, I like to think so at this point after all these years. But I also think that there are some issues that I care deeply and passionately about that are not on our agenda. And that's okay too. Those are my issues. Those are my passions. And to a certain extent, I don't talk about them in the course of my work. Or I will say to somebody, look, this is how I feel. This is not where our community's at. My job is to make sure that our elected officials, our interfaith partners, the local media with whom we connect, understand the breadth and the mood of the 40 organizations at the table and of the people across our community who may not even be in relationship with each other, but should all be seen by our civic leaders as they understand our Jewish community.
What do you say to somebody who looks at this and says, okay, 40 organizations represent the community. Who is JCRC to represent me?
Candidly, for different people, the answer is different, not because our answer is different, but because their reality is different. We strive to see and articulate all the components of our community, the parts of our community, even when we take a posture on something. We don't want to dismiss people because they are not aligned with the position we've taken. And we also want to acknowledge that they are part of who we are. So if we look at today's letter to the community in this case, I'm being transparent about the position that I advised our senators to take if I was in their shoes, which is to say that I had said to both of our senators prior to the vote in Congress that if I was a senator, I would have voted against the Sanders resolutions. That's obviously not the posture they ended up taking or that they were planning to take anyway, but they know that that's my position, that like I would have done in their shoes. But I was also very clear with them, and I'm always clear with them, that would be my choice if I was in your shoes. Here's where the community's at. Here are thinking of the community. Here's the diversity.
And that's the most important distinction here.
And that's the important distinction. And so when sending a letter out to the community today, I want the community to know transparently that I told our senators that if I was in their shoes, I would have voted the other way. But I also want to reflect back to the community what we heard from our council, which was a diversity of views, but also overwhelmingly in one direction on this issue. And by that, I mean, I respect those members of our council who came back and said, I support our senator's position. I respect those members of our council who say, in response to that question we put to them about this, that they are deeply, deeply frustrated with the way the government of Israel has prosecuted the war in Gaza and are okay with the United States Senate or some senators sending a message through a vote. I want our community to know that we hear those people and that they're at the table and that I value their presence at the table. I also think it's important for the community to know that when that question was put of like, how are people feeling about the vote to that council, to those 40 organizations, a surprisingly one-sided number of people came back and said, we're actually really frustrated, disappointed, angry with our senators. And by surprisingly, I mean, I've been doing this for a long time. I have a pretty good sense of how individuals and organizations at our table tend to show up on issues. I take a certain pride in being able to
sense the community,
sense where the council is going to land when a question is put before it. And in this case, I was genuinely surprised by how much of the response that came back was angry, how much of the response that came back was disappointed. And I wanted to reflect that as well. Both, by the way, in follow-up conversation with the senators and their offices, and as well back to the community in what we're hearing. But that isn't my view, while I share it. It is also the view we're hearing from across this network of 40 organizations. It's not unanimous, and I don't want anybody to ever think it's unanimous.
Right.
In this case or any case, and I actually cannot think of a single concrete issue that we've ever put before them we've come back with a unanimous voice of the council beyond core support for our mission. Now, you asked a question about the person in the community, am I represented? I would say, do you see yourself represented not in the position we took, but in part of the voices we're giving voice to, even explaining the diversity we're holding? If you see yourself in that, then we have succeeded in giving voice to your concerns.
That's such a critical distinction.
And that's important. We're not always all going to agree, but we're going to try to respect and lift up your voice too. If you are involved in this community, if you are a member of any one of these 40 organizations, if you're a member of a conservative synagogue on the North Shore and you pay your dues there, and your conservative synagogue is part of the United Synagogue of Conservative Jewry, then you, through the places you opt into the Jewish community, are represented at our table.
I don't know if you're comfortable sharing this, but you have a funny story about somebody who was really upset and said, how can you possibly represent me? And you had an answer that reflected this.
Yeah, I mean, there was a time where somebody who was upset with the posture we took on something, I don't even remember what it was at the time, it's a long time ago. By the way, that person wrote me a note today, gently pointing out that it would be no surprise to me that he disagreed with the posture we took today. So I was not surprised by that because I know him and know him well and know how he thinks. But several years ago, he came and sat down with a group of our board members, was like, basically said, who elected you to speak on behalf of this organized network of the Jewish community? And my answer to him was, well, actually, you're a dues-paying member of these three organizations. By you choosing to support organizations that believe in a communal table, by you choosing to buy in to the kinds of Jewish spaces that believe that there is some value in being a network that can sometimes give voice as one, you've elected the people who sit at this table and elect our board and hire me. So yes, who elected me? You elected me. Now, that doesn't mean you have to be okay with what I've said. God knows we all have issues with, many of the things our elected leaders say. And I don't consider myself an elected leader in that sense. I just mean that I hold myself accountable to these 40 organizations. And if at any time these 40 organizations or any significant part of them were to say, you're not even trying to listen to us, then I have failed.
So how would you address an accusation maybe that perhaps we are out of step with a more progressive view or progressive organizations?
I hear that question. I could even turn it around and say, I also hear that question in how are we out of step with more conservative voices in our community?
Sure.
And I think the point is that so many parts of our community feel that institutions are out of step with that. And that's a bigger problem in American society, that people don't feel connected to institutions, don't feel trust in institutions. And we have to earn that trust every day, which is why we try to communicate in a way and be transparent about what we're saying. And that I think it's important that members of our community know what we're saying. But I don't think of that as a progressive question. I think of that as like, I hear it all the time from all parts of the community. And I know people in our community who feel that the establishment on High Street is too liberal for them and not representative of their concerns. I hear people who say we're too focused on a particular subset of the community. Like, I hear it all the time from all places. And I think that's one of the important things that we have to lift up and name to each other and hold ourselves accountable to, is like, people are talking to people like that. Another story I often tell is that I will go in one room to one organizational event and people come up to me and say, everybody I talk to agrees with me that blah, 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 blah about something that's going on in the community. And then like 6 hours later, I'll go to some other event in some other town at some other synagogue or organization. And people will come up to me and say, everybody I know agrees with me that blah, blah, blah. The opposite side of that issue that's playing out in the public space. Because the people in this temple with its particular culture and its particular politics in its particular part of our region are having a different conversation from the people in the other temple with the other politics and the other culture. and they're not talking to each other directly often. And that's a problem we have to work on.
And a lot of the data that they are digesting.
People follow validating news.
Right.
And that's a problem because it does mean that valuable information that might challenge our own critical analysis of issues doesn't always get to our own plates, self-included.
Is it?
By striving to talk to people in different neighborhoods, in different parts of our community, culturally, ideologically, I hope that we at JCRC, I don't just mean myself, we, the entire staff team, the entire board team, are bringing together a wider range of perspectives before we make decisions. That's not easy to do. And that's where we, again, lean into our counsel, is that we're saying, we know that you have a wider range of perspectives than I do or we do. Let's expand that circle, bring that all in, hear all those voices. And I will have council members who are saying things to me that I'm like, ooh, well, that makes me feel uncomfortable. Or like, I really disagree with that. Let me sit with that. Let me understand that. Let me follow up with you and ask you a question about that. I'll tell you an example of this sort of like data segmentation and things people say. It's not a secret that many members of our community feel that the younger generation is more progressive, more left, more outside of the traditional boundaries of American Jewish sort of collective thinking. We don't know, and I think it will probably take us another 6 months or a year to do deep studying of actually the vote that happened earlier this month. And I think there's some polling data that's come out and it has some suggestions about what's happened in different communities and why. But I'll tell you a story from 2020. It will surprise you to know that there was polling data and exit data from 2020 that showed that Jews under 40 were more likely to vote for Donald Trump in 2020 than Jews over 40. There are reasons for that. Not by much, by the way. We're talking about like 1-2%, margin of error. But it wasn't like in 2020, Jews under 40 were dramatically to the left of the whole Jewish community in their voting. And if anything, may have been ever so slightly more conservative than the Jewish community as a whole. So you have to ask yourself, why do so many of our stakeholders, why do so many people in the community have this narrative that younger Jews are outside the tent overwhelmingly to the left or heading that direction? And the reality is, their neighborhoods, it's their communities, it's in their congregations, but there are other congregations and other communities where the opposite is happening.
Right.
And the danger, when you start to look at little data points like that, the danger is that we as an American Jewish community may be headed toward a point where we're no longer really even sitting at one table. One of the things we say about us here at JCRC is like we were established in the early 1940s. And we were established because a wide range of organizations, 14 organizations, in fact, came together and said, we need to have some shared collective effort to relate to our local civic public leaders in elected office in interfaith space, which in those days meant the Christian space, and the local media in Boston, to deal with anti-Semitism issues. And that's the reason we were founded. If you were to look at those 14 organizations today, and look at the way they understand anti-Semitism, the way they understand the challenge. Let's forget the fact that we're now 40, but just look at those 14 organizations today. The idea that they could come together and create one collective table to work on anti-Semitism seems impossible. And by the way, one or two of them are no longer at the table,
right,
because of that.
Right.
So I think we're at a very high risk that in continuing down this path, if we go there of we, Jewish Americans, not listening to each other and not holding the differences within our community, we may reach a point where we're not even able to put forward a collective voice like the one that JCRC does. And right now, we are the largest collective voice of the Jewish community in Greater Boston, but we have to work for that every day. We are speaking on behalf of a network that's several 100,000 people, which is more than any other Jewish voice in this region at this moment. And coming back to the polling, coming back to like paying attention to data and surveys and what's out there, by and large, we strive for stances that reflect where 60, 70, even 90% of American Jews express a positive support for. Do we own that there are differences at the table about how to get there? Absolutely.
One individual person sits here and looks at something that you've said and says, this doesn't resonate with me at all. What they really should be saying, if we're going to lend credence to those opinions, is that what you're saying does not represent the Jewish community, which is not true. It does. And just because you don't feel entirely aligned with it doesn't mean that it doesn't represent our community's mood. And what you are saying absolutely does reflect our community sentiment, even if you personally don't feel like it does to you. You buy into this community and you're buying into the diversity of opinion, but also the network that produces this voice.
Essentially, yes. A community is unhealthy, a society is unhealthy when we're just pitted against each other to scrape by to that like first past the poll 50% plus one
healthy
type
center.
Politics. A healthy center is what we're looking for. A healthy center is one in which we are striving to build broad consensus-based politics. A healthy center is one in which I would say both political parties are looking to represent, serve, and lead a significant majority of, if not all, Americans through their world analysis, through their politics, through the work they do. I would say for the Jewish community, or for any voter, as an American voter, it's not good if I have to go into the voting booth and I've already written off one party.
Right.
I'm not saying everybody should vote for the party other than the one that they currently vote for, but I want two choices. I want to feel like there are two legitimate choices that are offering me a worldview I can get behind, a vision of the future that I can see and imagine myself being reflected in.
With opposing candidates at all levels. That's not true.
At every level of society. Like, we are a broken society if everybody is dismissing everybody and requiring everybody, frankly, to push further towards a certain amount of groupthink at one end of the ideological spectrum or the other. And I think a lot of people in the middle do feel abandoned in that kind of politics. I think a lot of people tune out some of the public discourse when they feel abandoned by the options before them. And I think we as a Jewish community, because we are committed to a healthy democracy, because we believe that we and all Americans thrive when we have a healthy democracy, have an interest in working to build that center.
Bears being said that we're not sitting down and having this conversation because there was some wide range pushback about the things that we say in general or the things that you've said today. That's not the case. But it's important for us to make it very clear what our role is here in the community, the work that we're doing and the voices we represent, so people have a bit more of an understanding when they do feel like maybe what we've said doesn't quite represent their feeling, that this is not just Jeremy's thoughts of the day. There is a serious amount of work being done on the ground with our network to arrive at the positions we've arrived at, the statements we arrive at, and the policy recommendations we make, and even the advocacy we do. Everything we do is based on that. For those who might be feeling discouraged by something we say at some point in time, just know that that's not Jeremy just sat down with a vendetta. I'm
laughing. I'm not sure I've ever sat down and given voice to a vendetta, but I suspect that if I ever do, you'll know it. What I think is, I want to say, and this is important, like, while overwhelmingly the feedback we've seen today, and I know we're having this conversation because this is one of the moments where I've said something or sent something out to the community, you want to help people understand how we got to that place. And we're going to do it again. And it's always to a lot of listening and a lot of inviting different and diverse opinions into conversation and being curious about them all. There have also been people today who I deeply respect who are like, I take issue with the posture you took. I take issue with where you landed. And I always want to be asking the question, let us respect each other's differences or disagreements about where we're landing on something. But can we also make sure that we are respecting that each other is coming to that with very real, valid human concerns that we collectively have a responsibility to hold? And I hope that that was reflected in what I was reflecting back to the community from what we heard from our council members in the last few days. And I hope we're holding ourselves to that standard at all times of being the kind of network that is able to take a stance on important issues of the time while also holding the totality of our multitudes.